Okay, we're going to be looking at our third sermon on Gideon. We're working our way through the book of Judges. Gideon was one of the main judges. We have a bunch of kind of small judges that we don't know anything about, but Gideon was one of the main judges. I got a series of 5 sermons on Samson. We had a couple sermons on Deborah, but this is the third sermon on Gideon. Mickey preached last week, but the week before, you remember, 2 weeks ago, the Lord had called Gideon and helped him with his fears. And then 2 weeks ago, we looked at how Gideon had that great victory over the Midianites. He defeated the Midianites. Okay, and as always, I start off with some humor. I hope it is humorous. I laugh at them. A Christian couple looking for a new church visited one down the street. They liked sitting near the front, so they walked down and sat in the second pew. Soon an usher tapped the man on the shoulder and said to him, "Excuse me, sir, but this pew is saved." The man turned to his wife and said excitedly, "Wow, in this church, even the pews get saved." I like that one. I got a cartoon here for you. Remember in the early parts of the Old Testament, people lived Methuselah lived 900 and some years. Well, this guy's looking at the Social Security rules, and he says, those jerks are raising retirement age to 800. I thought that was cute. Having recently retired myself, I would have to wait until I'm 800 before I could get Social Security. Okay, let's get into our text. Here's my outline. I got 7 points for today, working our way through chapter 8. First of all, the tribe of Ephraim got a little bit ticked over the battle because they weren't included. So Gideon acts as a politician here, and he appeases the tribe of Ephraim. The tribe of Ephraim, that's kind of interesting because they almost caused some problems here with Gideon. Gideon smoothed it out. But when we get to Jephthah, they actually begin to battle Jephthah, another one of the judges. Anyway, appeasing of Ephraim. Revenge on Succoth and Penuel. They refused to help Gideon. And then there was some revenge enacted upon them. And then we have the defeat of a couple of the remaining kings, the Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. How would you like those names? Zebah and Zalmunna. Gideon will not become their king. They wanted to make Gideon their king. Remember, these judges, though it says they ruled, it was the Lord who was ruling. They were just turning the people back to the Lord and having him obey the Lord. They wanted Gideon to become their king. Though he was a judge, he refused to become their king. It was the Lord who was to become their king. But then, something kind of strange as we get near the end of this chapter, Gideon makes an ephod, and we will talk about that when we get there. You say, what is an ephod? We'll talk about that. And then we have the death of Gideon, as mentioned in these verses 29 through 32. And then point number 7, as soon, it says, as Gideon died, the people turn away from the Lord again. The whole cycle of the judges going on again. Okay, let's start in here. The appeasing of Ephraim, verses 1, 2, and 3. Then the men of Ephraim said to him, "What is this that you have done to us? Not to call us when you went to fight against Midian." And they accused him fiercely. So they were upset because they didn't get to partake in the war. You know, you remember the Lord cut Gideon's army down to 300. Well, they were mad that they weren't included in this. Now, Gideon was a little bit of a politician here too, you know, so he knew what to say to him. And he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer, God has given into your hand the princes of Midian, Orb and Zeb. Those two ran away, and it was the Ephraimites that caught them. What have I been able to do in comparison to you? Then the anger against him subsided when he said this. So he calmed him down. You know, Gideon had fought the whole war. A couple of them ran, and Ephraim, well, I got some of those verses. This is at the end of chapter 7. It tells us about that. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim. So he did invite them down, saying, come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan. And they captured the two princes of Midian, Orb and Zeb. They killed Orb at the rock of Orb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Remember, we read those verses. They named that rock and they named that winepress after that great victory they had over them. So that was Ephraim. So Ephraim was mad because Gideon didn't call him at the beginning. Well, that was the Lord's doing. The Lord had cut his army down to just 300, and Ephraim was ticked off that they didn't get invited to the war. You know, you ever get easily offended? I didn't get invited to that party or that wedding or that whatever it might be. Calm down. So Gideon appeased the Ephraimites. I got some comments here. Gideon had not taken the time to get Ephraim involved in the battle at the beginning. Remember, the Lord had cut his army down to 300. You remember that? But now the tribe of Ephraim was upset with him. Later, Jephthah will have problems with them. Well, we'll see that in a few weeks. But Gideon proves to be a good politician. Maybe that's not a good way to reflect on Gideon, because Gideon calmed them down. You know, that's a good trait to have. Sometimes people get all worked up and they're really mad. But if you're able to go to them and talk calmly, remember the book of Proverbs says, a soft answer turns away wrath. So just be calm, talk to them, calm them down. That's what Gideon did with Ephraim. He calms them down, and they are satisfied with his explanation. You got to partake of the battle. You got that Orb and Zeb. You were a major part of this. So they said, I guess we were. And then they went home. They were satisfied. Point number 2, revenge on Succoth and Penuel, verses 4 through 9. And Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted yet pursuing. They were pursuing the fleeing Midianite army. Okay? So he said to the men of Succoth, please give me loaves of bread. Now Succoth is an Israelite town. Please give me loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, a couple of the kings of the Midianites. And the officials of Succoth said, forget you, buddy, we're not going to help. Oh, that ain't what it says, but that's John Herrick translation. Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands that we should give bread to your army? So they wouldn't do it. So Gideon said, well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. So he says, I'm going to come back and you will pay for this. And from there, he went to Penuel, and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. No, forget it. We're not going to give you our bread. You just go on. And he said to the men of Penuel, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. They had a big city tower, and Gideon said when he comes back, he would break down their tower. Okay, I jumped a few verses here. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned. He had already, the verses I skipped, we're going to look at in a minute. He defeats Zebah and Zalmunna. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and he wrote down, so he finds this young guy, and he wrote down for him the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 men. So he catches this young guy. He says, what town are you from? Oh, I'm from Succoth. All right, I want you to give me all the names of your leaders. They were the ones that made the decision not to help my army. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars with them, taught the men of Succoth a lesson. Isn't that an interesting way to put it? The writer of the book of Judges, he had to teach them something, and he taught them a lesson. And he broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. So here they would not help. So I asked the question, as Gideon is chasing the enemy, he comes to several of the Israelite cities, Succoth and Penuel. He asks both of them for bread and food for his troops. They both refuse to help him. So he tells them when he has finished with the enemy, he would come back and teach them a lesson. I'm going to teach you a lesson, buddy. And that's exactly, I wonder if that's where that expression came from out of the book of Judges here. He fulfilled this when the battle was over. Okay, so I asked the question, was this right for him to do? Should Gideon acted in this way? Was it revenge because he was mad at him? On the other hand, he was doing the Lord's work, and they refused to help in the Lord's work. Cross-reference, Romans 12:19, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So we need to be careful about that. We get mad at somebody about something, and we scheme and connive and think, well, how can we get back at that? Just calm down. The Lord will make it right, Point number 3, the defeat of Zebah and Zalmunna, verses 8 through 12 and then 18 through 21. Now, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkar, all right, there's a nice city, Karkor, with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left in all the army of the people of the east. For there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. Wow, Israel had had a great victory, still chasing the remnant of the army. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Jogbehah and attacked the army, for the army felt secure. They didn't think Israel was going to come that far and going to catch up to them, and they felt they were safe. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and they pursued them and captured the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and they threw all the army into a panic. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, where are the men who you killed at Tabor? They answered, as you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king. And he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. So they had killed Gideon. Remember, Gideon says, I'm the least of my family. Well, these kings had killed his brothers. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you. So he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise and kill them." But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid. So this is Gideon's son. And he says, they killed all of your uncles. Go kill them. And the young man, how much had he done? How many people had he killed? He was a bit afraid of killing these kings. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength." And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on their necks on the necks of their camels. All right, so isn't that an interesting fact? Why did the author of Judges throw that in there? Well, I was reading a little bit. Some of the Bible scholars think that those ornaments kind of were worshiping their gods, but it meant that they were, victorious. So Gideon took them away because Zebah and Zalmunna were not victorious anymore. All right, now we get into kind of the meat of the chapter. Okay, Gideon had this great victory over the Midianites, and he was their judge. He turned the people back to the Lord. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, now this is the men of Israel, this is the whole country. A lot of these judges were just a couple of tribes were involved, but here it seems that because of what Gideon did, all of Israel was involved in this. "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Now the Lord had told them that they were not to have a king. They had local rulers over various tribes, but they were not to have a king over them. The Lord was their king. But now Israel, they were so great. Gideon was such a warrior. They wanted to start a dynasty, Gideon and his sons and his grandsons to be their kings. Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." So he wouldn't do it. Shows his character. He could have had great power and rule as king over Israel, but he knew that was against the Lord's will. So he was willing to obey the Lord. Cross-reference. This is later, 1 Samuel. Okay, you got Judges, Ruth, and then you go into the history in Samuel. Well, so one of the last judges, Samuel, he wasn't in the book of Judges, but he's considered to be one of the judges. This involved him some years after Gideon. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge over us like all the nations." Now here they again want a king. It seems like throughout that time they had wanted a king. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. Notice this. "And the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, Samuel, but they have rejected me from being king over them." Now the first king they got was Saul, who turned out to be a miserable failure. And then the next king they got was David, whom the Lord was with, and the Lord made covenants with David, still in effect in his people today. Here's though where they wanted a king, just like back in Gideon's day. Good cross-reference here. All right, so this is now an interesting story. I don't fully understand it. Bible scholars don't fully understand it, but here's what happened. Gideon says, "No, I'm not going to be your king, and Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you, okay? I'm not going to be your king, but I want you to do me a favor. Every one of you give me the earrings from from his spoil. They had gotten a bunch of spoil from the Midianites, bringing in probably just baskets and baskets of gold and earrings and jewelry and stuff like that, valuable things. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites, the Midianites were. And they answered, "We will willingly give them." And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. Okay, so they gave him all of these golden earrings. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments. Remember it mentioned those ornaments earlier, and the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. All right, so he had a whole bunch here. And Gideon took this gold, melted it down, made an ephod of it, and put it in his city at Ophrah. Now, we'll talk about this. Why did he make that? What was his motive in making it? Were the people doing what he wanted, or did they take it way too far? Notice what it says. And all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. Notice the word it used there. They whored after it. The worshiping of idols, this became an idol in Israel. They loved to worship idols during this time of the judges. And Gideon got them away from that. Gideon makes this ephod, and Israel makes it an idol. Interesting comparison that used the word, they prostituted themselves after it. It compares a husband or a wife being unfaithful to their mate with Israel being unfaithful to their God and worshiping idols. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. So verse 28 is the result of 27. The making of this ephod. Well, first of all, what was Gideon's ephod? Well, the Hebrew word it's kind of interesting. The Hebrew word for this was ephod. The translators didn't know exactly what this was, though it was mentioned in the priestly garments. So instead of translating it, they simply brought over the Hebrew word ephod. Okay? Now, what is an ephod? Well, in early books of the Bible, the ephod was a special piece of clothing that was made for Aaron the high priest to wear, so a piece of clothing to wear when he served the Lord. Okay, he had his robe, and then they put the ephod over his robe, and then they put the breastplate with stones for all of the tribes of Israel over the ephod. So it was an article of clothing. The object made by Gideon from molten gold logically cannot have been, a garment. It's made of gold. It's not made of linen. The object made by Gideon is plainly described as having been worshipped. Therefore, the idol of some deity, or maybe, and this is what I think it was, maybe a golden representation of the ephod. The significance of the ephod in Judges is that, once again, God's people do not trust in him or give him glory for the things he has done for them, but they go astray and break his commandments and make for themselves idols and worshiping them. Priestly garment, I got on here, where's my, here underneath the breastplate, up here, but this thing here was the ephod. So you got the robe, you got an ephod, and then you got the breastplate. But Gideon made it out of gold. Well, some think, so here's the priestly garments again. Oh, quit it, hit the wrong button. Here's the priestly garments again, over here. And here's an artist's conception of what Gideon perhaps made. He made a golden representation of the priest's ephod. The ephod was the priest's garments. They were, kind of like a priest's collar or a nun's habit, They were looked at as being holy and special. And so Gideon, he takes this gold, he melts it down, and he makes an ephod out of it. And once it was made into a golden ephod, we don't know whether Gideon worshipped it, but the people around Israel, they thought, oh, wow, and they kind of, it says they come whoring after it. They began to worship this thing as an idol. Isn't it interesting how easy it is to slip into idolatry? We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Comments. What was Gideon's motive in asking for this gold? Bible scholars debate that. We do not know whether Gideon intended this object to be worshipped as an idol. Why did he make it? But when it was worshipped in Israel, Gideon's testimony was somewhat ruined. It says his family suffered for it. No, verse 27. And Gideon made an ephod and put it in the city of Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it there. And it, notice this, it became a snare, a trap to Gideon and his family. Did they kind of take pride that everybody was worshiping his ephod? And then the next verse says that he was subdued because of this. He was looked down upon. He was not revered as a great judge anymore because of this. So it ruined his testimony among the people of Israel. Here's a cross-reference. So Gideon took all of this gold, melted it down, and made this ephod. Well, that reminded me of another Bible story much earlier when they had left Egypt. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And so Aaron said to them, here we go, take off the rings of gold that are that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. I got a chuckle here. The men didn't give anything. They stole their wives' jewelry and put that involved in there. So the people took off the rings of gold that were in the ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. Is that all I had? Yeah. This is what's interesting about it. When Moses came down, Moses was mad. And Aaron had this story that, I just put the gold into the fire and it came out like this, It didn't. Aaron took a graving tool and fashioned it into a golden calf, Okay, here's a cross-reference. Okay, New Testament, Colossians 3. Paul is listing some sins that we need to be careful for, okay? Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. Sexual immorality, we need to put that to death. Impurity, passion, evil desire, and then he says, and covetousness. Covetousness is always wanting things that we don't have. And then Paul, Greek did not have a comma, but in English, if he was writing in English, he puts a comma, and then he puts a little bitty phrase in there describing covetousness. So how do we relate all of these Old Testament stories of Israel, especially in Judges, Israel going after idols all the time, to our own lives? We don't fall down and worship golden calves or golden ephods or the gods of the Midianites or Canaanites. We don't practice idolatry. Well, Paul says here, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So Paul expands the narrow meaning of covetousness. Whenever you covet something, now I don't know about you, I am a gadget junkie, especially electronic. My wife will tell you this, especially electronic gadgets. And you know what? Facebook knows this. So I see on my Facebook account all the time advertisements for, wow, that'd be kind of neat to have, you know. Now, I have learned not to go to those funny websites and order from them, because a lot of times you never get your product. They get your money and you never get your product. So I immediately go to Amazon. I can trust Amazon. I go to Amazon. I try to find the product, and it's going to be here in 2 days. I order it. It gets here in 2 days. I'm all excited about it. I open the box. I play with it for about a half an hour, and then, oh, okay, well, that was kind of nice. And then I go on to my next gadget junkie fix, you know. We are always wanting things in our lives. We are covetous. Covetousness is a lack of contentment. It is saying, God, you have not given to me everything that I want or need. Paul says here that covetousness is really idolatry. We need to be careful about it. We are whoring, using that word that was used in the Judges. We are whoring after these material things that we want, whether it's a new car, a new house, a new whatever it might be. And it becomes an idol in our lives. All right, the death of Gideon. Jerubbaal, you remember that was the name of Gideon. They gave it to him after he had destroyed his father's Baal idol, and they were going to kill Gideon, and Gideon's father said, hey, let Baal contend for himself. Not Jerubbaal, that's another guy. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon, now it went back to his other name, had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives, okay? And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. Now this gets into the next chapter. I won't rob my thunder for next week, but Gideon's sons and Abimelech play a major part in next week's story. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash's father at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. All right. He lived a good old age, had been faithful to the Lord for the most part. Isn't it interesting? The only tarnish on Gideon's name, Gideon had been faithful, the Lord called him, the Lord encouraged him, he'd been faithful to the Lord, he refused to be their king. The only tarnish on his name was that making of that ephod, and people came after that. All right, the people turned from the Lord. Notice this verse 33. And as soon as Gideon died, the dirt wasn't even dry on the grave yet, you know, the body was still warm. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. Boy, that sure didn't take long. One of the jobs of the judges was not only to free the Israelites, but was to keep the Israelites faithful to the Lord. And Gideon did that. They knew as long as Gideon was around, although they worshipped his ephod, but as soon as Gideon died, Israel turned back to idolatry. I go back to that verse where it says covetousness is idolatry. We could say here, those Israelites, they had such a tendency towards idolatry. But if covetousness and lusting after material things is the same thing as idolatry, could it be said of us that, boy, we sure have a tendency towards idolatry, just like they did? And the people of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hand of all the enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Gideon in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. Well, yeah, they were probably trying to take a stand for the Lord, and Israel was worshiping idols, and so Gideon's family got pushed aside. Now that verse leads us into the next chapter, a story about Abimelech. All right, conclusion. What can we say about this? Kind of an odd chapter. As we go through Judges, lots of narration, lots of stories. Is there a point to all the stories? Well, that's what I'm trying to bring out here for us. There are a number of lessons in this text this week. Revenge. Did Gideon take revenge when he should have left it alone to the Lord? God says not to take revenge, but let the Lord handle the matter. Second, God wants to be king of our lives. Now we have government leaders who we are to obey, but God is, I got a couple of words repeated there, but God is to be the real king of our lives. And then we need to be careful you do not have idols in your life. It is easy to make things have an improper priority in your life. There's a good way of saying it. It is easy to have things become an improper priority in our lives. God must be first. All right, let's close in a word of prayer.